Today's gospel reading comes from Matthew, where Jesus said to the disciples, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a sibling, you will be liable to judgment, and if you insult a sibling, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your sibling has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your sibling, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with them, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." Beloved community, we have a challenging biblical text before us this morning. And it's not just because it appears that Jesus is telling people to tear out their eyes and cut off their limbs. But this text is challenging also because Jesus is teaching about the important and urgent work within human relationships. And Jesus brings up all sorts of painful, complex things like adultery, divorce, betrayal, murder. We humans face unbelievably challenging circumstances at times in our relationships. And our text for today has some important insight for us when we examine the underlying meaning to these words. Before I moved to Chicago 3 years ago, I lived in Argentina, South America. And part of my job was to be a translator, English to Spanish, Spanish to English. I was a translator of words, of language. But I was also a translator of culture. So I know from experience that when multiple cultures are present, context is really important to understanding words. And even though we might have one understanding after the first time certain words are communicated, depending on the cultural understanding and the context, those same words might have a totally different meaning underneath. And sometimes it takes work and time and conversation and attentive listening in our relationships for that underlying meaning to be understood. So I never quite knew how to translate for English speakers who would say things like, "I'm just gonna go jump in the shower," or "Could you run to the store to get that for me?" Like, jumping in the shower to someone who is not from the United States culture sounds like a recipe for an emergency room visit. Like, whoa, that is not safe. Why would you do that? And asking someone to run to the store isn't necessarily asking for that person to sprint on foot to go retrieve that item. Or when I would translate for Spanish speakers who would say things like un cafecito. Café in Spanish is coffee, and if you add an ito ending, it makes it the smaller version of that thing, even though no one actually wanted a tiny coffee when they said un cafecito. It was a saying that had this underlying meaning to these surface words. So even though Jesus' words say, "Tear your eye out if it is causing you to sin," Jesus was using this striking imagery to underline just how important it is to maintain trust and compassion in our human relationships. The people in this context were trying to understand their identity in a world that was changing. They were trying to understand their identity in a faith community that was changing. There was this tension between what has always been and what God is calling us to become to respond to this ever-changing learning and growing. Jesus was talking to his disciples, who were Jewish people, followers of Jesus, their Jewish teacher, who did things very differently than they were used to, but also sometimes very much in line with their values and their heritage. And they just were trying to figure out what all of that meant. In our text for today, Jesus emphasizes the importance of working to maintain trust and compassion in our human relationships. This was a regular community. There were conflicts, there were betrayals, there were insecurities and fears, there were insults given, there was division. There was also incredible connection and support. There were many sources of deep joy and delight. Any type of community faces both joys and challenges. Jesus' words say a phrase like, "Cut off your limb if it's causing you to sin." But the message underneath those words was Jesus calling the people to drastically, courageously do that really hard emotional work that is conflict resolution and reconciliation. Jesus was calling the disciples to the vulnerable, risky work to maintain trust and compassion among one another because they were his community. And a connection to community is a key part of how we all experience fullness of life. And Jesus continues to call us as disciples to the really vulnerable work that is restoring trust when trust has been broken. And that is very hard work. Jesus continues to call us to the hard work that is showing compassion when people in our lives fail to show us compassion. Part of my training to become a pastor in the ELCA has included something called clinical pastoral education. And it's usually this immersion experience that is in a setting where people experience a lot of pain, a lot of crisis, a lot of suffering. And I completed this training at a hospital in downtown Chicago. And while the patients and the families that I visited and the care teams that I worked with taught me a lot about human relationships and trust and compassion, this morning I want to lift up the other students who were with me in my learning cohort. We would meet twice a week with our supervisor and our group conversations and our interactions were vulnerable and risky. And there were moments where trust was broken. And in those moments, instead of running away or pretending like something never happened, our supervisor guided us so that we addressed that broken trust courageously and head on. And wow, were those some tense conversations. Emotions were high. It was vulnerable and uncomfortable, but we knew we were working through it together. That type of reconciliation was very new for me, and I could not have done that process by myself. I needed community to help me in that process, and I needed to show up for my community in that process. We grew. We shared with one another. We did risky conflict resolution and reconciliation. And we experienced resurrection, a whole new level of trust and compassion because of the ways that God was working through us in that work in community. And this memory reminds me of what we all say in worship each time we receive new members at Grace. And I'm going to read some of that to you. We say, "We promise to welcome your faith as it flows through life's joys and challenges. We desire for this church to be a safe place where you can show up as your true self and be received with love and grace. We are in this together. In this community, we choose curiosity over certainty and strive to honor each other's faith expressions and life experiences with respect and love." And then someone from our church council who represents all of us says, "We also acknowledge that we will fail you. This congregation will both embrace and resist change. Sometimes we will disagree and make mistakes. So we ask that on this side of disappointment, you promise to stay with us for the healing that surely comes. Because if you go before the listening and the mending, you will miss the holy thing about being the church, the dying and the rising, the forgiving and the living. Do you desire to become members of this congregation, investing in the future of this shared mission and ministry?" Beloved community, Jesus calls us into community, and within that community calls us to that courageous work, to really cultivate trust and compassion in those relationships. Human relationships can break us. Human relationships can heal us. We, like the people in Jesus' time, are in an ever-changing world, and our faith community is changing. We hold that tension between what has always been and who God is calling us to become. And God is clear that God keeps calling us into community. We are a people of death and resurrection. And our text for today reminds us that God goes with us along this emotional and risky journey, comforting us, liberating us, empowering us to work for reconciliation, to do the difficult, to do the drastic, perhaps even long process of healing. God calls us into community for this work that we cannot do alone. Whenever we celebrate a baptism, we as the faith community make a commitment to the baptized person and to one another. In baptism, we take responsibility for those relationships, to accompany one another in the joys and the challenges and in that hard work of reconciliation. as we declare to our new members, we are in this together. And God promises to always give us strength and guidance along the way. Amen. At this time, the music will be playing, and while the music plays, I invite us to reflect on this question. What have been the relationships in your life that have given you healing and life? You might reflect on the names of those people who have given you healing through their relationship with you. You might reflect on the memories that surface when you think of that healing. Or you might reflect on what has that healing been for you through relationships that have given you life.